My name's Tom Emerson. I'm an architect and co-founder with Stephanie MacDonald of 6A Architects in London, and I'm a professor at the Department of Architecture in ETH Zurich. In London, our practice does mainly cultural, educational buildings, often in London, but not always, also in continental Europe, and it's really about the kind of reuse of the city. It's particularly focused around kind of construction, the garden, landscape as a kind of new paradigm for architecture. And at ETH, our studio is sort of concerned with similar issues to do with the environment, making, and the territory, but perhaps at a more speculative and kind of a larger scale as well as a smaller scale. And our newest sort of research project at the moment, alongside the atlases, which are big surveys, is a garden, a real garden, which is being made over several years with different generations of students. So it's all about the kind of the layering of different interventions and the looking after of previous ones. So kind of the garden as a kind of paradigm for the world, the city, and how things work. So this idea of practice, precision, making, being not just the kind of the consequence of the way that they do things, is at the very heart of the way that they do things here. And in that sense, I would say that that's where maybe there is and there has been for a long time quite a strong natural affiliation between British culture and Swiss culture. I mean, it goes back to the 19th century and all the rest of it, but it's certainly strong now. Not so much the precision. I think that British culture is fundamentally approximate. It's to do with topography, it's to do with a kind of this sort of the way that the island culture works, but certainly a culture in which practice is probably valued higher than theory. It's a fundamentally pragmatic culture. It's kind of empirical. Pragmatism has been sort of at the heart of kind of British philosophy even since the 18th century. And this idea of doing first and then thinking later is really, I would say, something that corresponds. Certainly in Switzerland, the institutions, the rules, the precision is at a kind of, is much more explicitly felt in all areas of kind of life and culture. That may be because it's more recent, because the country is very extreme topographically, and you could say the difference, a little bit of approximation can be the difference between life and death in the mountain. Whereas, the rolling hills of England, if you're 3 meters out, it doesn't really matter. Specifically in Switzerland, I would say that it's manifested in, you could say, highly regulated liberalism. So there is a side of Swiss culture which is extremely liberal, whether it comes from things like squatting culture, demonstrations, but all of that happens within a kind of very highly regulated environment. So, there may be the demonstration, there may be alternative subcultures and stuff like that, but by tomorrow morning, everything will be cleaned up. So there is a sort of an acceptance of quite a wide varieties of behaviour in public space. Most of it is extremely orderly, occasionally rather less orderly. But whatever happens, there is a sort of supra layer, which I think comes from the administration, comes from a kind of maintenance culture, which is extremely highly developed. I think in this case I'm probably talking more about Zurich, which I know better than Basel. To be honest, I certainly would not claim I know Basel well enough to try to give it a definition, and to maybe um, slightly contradict my own description of London, but to take Georges Perec's quote where he says, "Don't try and find an easy definition for the city, you'll only get it wrong, it's too complex." So in that sense, I'll proceed cautiously. But the thing that you said, I certainly do feel that Basel, its scale is explicit when you first arrive there. This sort of, the fact that it's actually a relatively small city, and you sort of know instinctively its size, even without reaching to its boundaries, through the scale and density of the kind of urban space. Even the walk from the railway station to the river and across the river somehow gives you a very good measure of the place. And it is, the thing that's interesting is you describe it in terms of the kind of the three nation kind of intersection. I would say that that is not the overwhelming impression one gets of Basel. You get an impression of Basel being Basel. And it's that three-nation kind of encounter, you really only experience it in quite subtle ways. There's this very curious little procession through the railway station when you take a train to France, for example. You have to go through another lobby, which somehow it's almost like a kind of Alice in Wonderland procedure. You go through a foyer and then you're in France. Occasionally, through the languages that you hear, you get a kind of strong sense of that borderland condition, that that the French, German, Swiss German are somehow always in the background. But I would say that stronger than that is the sense of Basel being Basel, and in my view, extremely Swiss. I mean, there's probably the river is one thing, which is sort of fundamental to the kind of genus loci of Basel. But the one which is sort of the most, I would say, one of the most unusual ones, the spectacular ones, is the Langerau, which is the subject that we've been studying over the last 2 semesters, really at the invitation of Jacques Herzog and Pierre de Meuron, where we've produced one of the kind of atlas surveys with our students. And that is, on the surface, a kind of very loose and irregular, almost natural, you could call it, form of kind of parkland. But actually, it's extremely Swiss in the sense that it is not a natural parkland. It has all the appearances of such, but it's in fact an infrastructural instrument. It's an extremely highly carefully constructed and maintained, primarily an instrument for producing drinking water for the city, for extracting water from the Rhine and then filtering it through the kind of parkland and the woodland, and then extracting it as drinking water. But it also contains remnants of other infrastructures, of complex railway intersections, complex land ownership between German railways on Swiss land. The boundary between, the border between Germany and Switzerland goes through Langerau, but it's extremely difficult to identify it on the ground. You can see it through different types of landscape maintenance, actually, the way that they keep their woodland, the way that they keep their fields, the way that, but it's at a very sort of subtle level. So it's an extremely interesting space in that it's highly political space. It is the borderland. It has been historically also a contested area of defence between Switzerland and the outside world in the early 19th century. It's also been the site of, I think, some of the most successful, I mean, really wonderful social housing projects of the 1920s and 30s, like Bernoulli and people like that. So it has this very interesting peripheral urban structure, but primarily it's this sort of mechanical parkland that is a place of recreation for a very large part of the population. It's a place where people can meet across the borders. It's also then this place that is one of the mechanical instruments of the city. And I think in that sense it's extremely unusual. It is very Swiss, if you go back to Marc Angelil's comment about kind of precision and making and operating a landscape. And then at the same time, it's a fantastic sort of natural habitat, kind of ecologically, biodiversity, and even in kind of picturesque terms. So it's a kind of really very special place. And it really came off the back of a series of other research and design projects that we had set, focused around the idea of the atlas. Generally, these have been in, you could say, post-industrial cities. They started in around about 2011, 2012, which was really trying to respond to the kind of the post-recession kind of condition in Europe. So we already knew about the post-industrial condition, where regeneration was a more or less accepted method by which kind of declining cities could find new life. This normally took the form of, you could say, extreme capital investment on the part of institutions or corporations, a university, a museum, that sort of thing. And in the kind of post-recession era, suddenly we were faced with a moment when these injections of capital were not going to happen. So the question is, what happens next? So we started looking at, you could say, declining or shrinking industrial cities, but not from the perspective of the master plan, from the perspective of the survey. So taking the idea that the first act of design is in the observation, and that at ETH, where we have very large studios, very large numbers of students, the greatest asset you have there collectively is that you can make very substantial documentary projects. So we started a kind of method by which our students would go to these places, Forst in Germany, for example, on the German-Polish border, Glasgow, Galway on the western coast of Ireland, all places that had been, you could say, very heavily hit by the decline of industry, and tried to find almost the instructions for their own renaissance within what we find on site. So within perhaps the renaturalization that happened spontaneously in places like Forst, where what was city just became woodland just because no one was there. So the methodology was really to try and find the key to the future in the remains of what's there. Also explicitly in a very empirical form. So this was about going to the place and recording what you see, what you find, measuring, photographing, drawing as you find it, not necessarily as data might describe it. So it's a very kind of feet on the ground type of urbanism. And then this led to a series of interventions which were often very small physical interventions, but with the aim of very substantial territorial transformation. So, for example, trying to redefine particularly boundaries, edges, historic land use patterns, and to try and subvert those with fences, bridges, small structures that might change the course of a particular city. And it was this methodology that Hertog and Meuron were interested in kind of applying to the Langerau. I mean, certainly Studio Basel has always had this kind of mantra of only build on the built, which corresponds in a sense quite well to the idea of the survey, because it's essentially trying to record as best you can the conditions that you find before acting. But of course, the survey is in itself an act of design, because it selects some things to document while rejecting others. and therefore you have already constituted a sort of picture, an idea of the place before even a physical intervention. And then the idea is that the physical intervention then grows naturally out of that. So some of the consequences may be, for example, revisiting the idea of the garden city, the kind of late 19th century, early 20th century experiments in England, Germany in particular, some in America and some in Switzerland, but particularly in England. But maybe the idea of the garden city not as a kind of utopian ideal, but as a retrofit thing, something that happens naturally. And it certainly does in places like Glasgow, Forst or Galway, where very substantial parts of city have been, through lack of use, have been recolonised by nature, and that's a process that could be harnessed, managed, even kind of sort of art directed. And so coming to Langerau, which is, you could say, is a fantastic case study because it is a highly constructed and managed natural landscape. And not only does it have those elements of infrastructure like the water purification, the Weser that's been kind of canalised, the railways, it also has a sort of historical layering, as we've already discussed, with the kind of borders that go through the site, but even things like the Boomleyhof, kind of a Baroque garden with its pavilion. It has different traditions of productive landscapes like agriculture, which are, you could say, not huge, but certainly form part of the kind of the spatial and political context of the place. So essentially the project was run over 2 semesters. The first semester was really producing this atlas, producing this record of the place, both what's above ground, what's below ground, what's visible, invisible, different scales from a very, very micro scale of which type, like almost like a natural history, types of vegetation, to more architectural ones, and then more territorial ones. And then in the first semester, essentially the students were invited to make a proposal for a small structure, what we call the point. So something that may have the territorial, a relationship to the territory, not unlike, for example, a pumping station. So the pumping houses are small pavilions in the landscape, but in fact they're highly networked with the whole performance of the Langerau. And that they did, and with some very interesting results, because they always produced a kind of landscape proposal alongside them. And particularly in relation to what is Langerau, trying to define what this place is and what its future is. Its boundaries are extremely contested. I mean, there is no singular definition of Langerau. There are lots of different ones. And so people had different attempts to try and find a way of defining it. Is its future a kind of proto-Central Park where the pressure to develop more housing in particular will force a more defined idea of its boundary? Or is that kind of formal definition fundamentally against the kind of DNA of Basel and Swiss landscape? So that was perhaps one of the debates. And then in the second semester, the project was turned around to much larger development, so really addressing this fundamental shortage of housing, the need for housing, and finding ways of introducing very, very large housing proposals, which of course will be extremely controversial, but trying to sort of look at the future of Langerau from the point of view of large development as opposed to landscape interventions, and seeing to some extent which is more instrumental in transforming the place and which one has a better chance of taking the step into the future. The parts of Langerau which I think are most potent in terms of the future are probably fairly obviously the boundaries. And I would say particularly the western and southern boundary, because that's where it interacts with the city most closely. That's also where it interacts with both disused and current infrastructure. So negotiating its edges I think is full of opportunity around Badischer Bahnhof, particularly then also the southern end of Langerau as a kind of territory of Loosewitz, the Schrebergarten, Stadia, light industrial housing zones, somehow make their way down to the Rhine. And I think that is also an area of enormous potential, and I think it's very exciting. Of course, there is one of the largest land users in that territory are the Schrebergardens, the allotment gardens, which are very, very controversial issue when it comes to development, because they are obviously places of enormous sort of cultural diversity, recreation, productivity. At the same time, to have such a large number of Schrebergardens within a central metropolitan area that is in need of land for development is also very controversial. You could say the kind of the private use of public land. And I think that there's been a lot of work. Students have really kind of tried to address the issue of how do you develop and also remain committed to the kind of values and the kind of qualities of Schrebergardens. To me, that seems very interesting. I know that there's been a proposal, I think, some years ago by Dina and Dina, which failed, I think, politically, because it touched this sort of holy ground. But nevertheless, I think that that's really where the main area of interest for potential change lies. I think on the northern boundary, also the Grünstadt area where there was the kind of garden fair on the German side, I think is also somewhere where both in terms of landscape structure and urban structure there could be more. But any intervention, any proposal will rightly be jumped on and probably contested, because it is a space that would be extremely easy to erode and to some extent destroy the very kind of loose qualities that make it very different, let's say, to a metropolitan park like Central Park or Hyde Park or something like that. It's not one of those. It doesn't belong to one of those metropolises that kind of survive by virtue of a highly structured parkland. This is a rather kind of unstructured parkland. And that's a quality that's very difficult at the kind of planning and architectural level to preserve, because it's, to some extent, you could say, it's what cities do, what landscape does when architects are not involved.